Welcome back to High School Math Analyzers. Today's topic, the imaginary unit I. What is imaginary unit I? There was a problem that needed to be solved. What can you do if you have a negative radical? You may think it can't be simplified anymore, or it's simply impossible to solve. But it is not. It can be solved. That's where I, or an imaginary number, comes in. The name is a little misleading, but an imaginary number is a number. I is essentially the square root of -1. You can use it to simplify any negative radical. There are three different outcomes. One of them is a perfect square. In this example, we'll use the square root of -16. You can divide the square root of -16 into the square root of 16 and the square root of -1. So the square root of 16 equals 4 because 4 times 4 equals 16. And we can substitute I for the square root of -1. So our final answer will be the square root of -16 equals to 4i. Another outcome you can have is a radical square. In this example, we'll use the square root of -8. You can divide the square root of -8 into the square root of 8 and the square root of -1. Remember that the imaginary number does not go inside the root. So the square root of 8 equals to 2 rad 2 because the square root of 8 can be broken into rad 4 and rad 2, or rad 4 times 2. We can simplify the square root of 4 into 2 because 2 times 2 equals 4. And we can substitute I for the square root of -1, making our new equation the square root of -8 equals to 2i times rad 2. Our third outcome is a radical square. In this example, we'll use the square root of -2. You can divide the square root of -2 into the square root of 2 and the square root of -1. Now, the square root of 2 cannot be simplified, so you must leave it as is. But we can substitute I for the square root of -1, making the new equation the square root of -2 equals to the square root of 2 times I. Remember that the I does not go inside the radical, it stays separate. So our final answer will be the square root of -2 equals to I times radical 2. Let's simplify the square root of -128. Our first step is to separate the square root of -128 into the square root of 128 and the square root of -1. Now this is because we know that the square root of -1 is the imaginary unit I. Our next step is to simplify the non-negative root if possible. So the square root of 128 will be the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. The square root of 64 is 8 because 8 times 8 is 64, and the square root of 2 can't be simplified anymore. So our next step is to substitute the square root of -1 with I. So we're going to write our new simplified equation, and remember that I is not in the root. So our final answer will be the square root of -128 is equal to 8i times rad 2. Now you try. Simplify the square root of -64 and simplify the square root of -102. Here are the solutions and steps on how to solve these problems. For the square root of -64, we got an answer of 8i, and the square root of -102, we got an answer of I times the square root of 102. Please leave any comments below if you have any questions. Please subscribe, hit the like button, comment, and share this video. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at High School Math Analyzers. Thank you. Do you still have any questions? Leave them in the comments below. We hope this video was helpful. We'll see you in the next one.